Most middle-aged people and older will remember the time of Diana's death and the mountains of flowers that were placed outside Kensington Palace. Then Blair's People's Princess speech. I think at the time we didn't realise that those mountains of flowers were testament to guilt, because Diana had appeared in countless newspaper articles. She was marvellous for journalists wanting to get readership for newspapers, a gift to them almost. And in a way, those who bought the newspapers to see the latest news about Diana and Dodie fired and all the other bits and pieces were viewing a grotesque tragedy. She had been manipulated by the BBC, particularly, to distrust those around her who were giving her, I think, fairly sound advice. And she genuinely believed, so it seems, that they were out to kill her. The BBC, it's a sideline, in a way has blood on its hands. And the establishment, or part of it, was going rogue. It's pretty grim. But what was shocking about the flowers, mountains of them, was that the motivation might have been quite surprising for many people. It was guilt. Because in a manner of speaking, the people who bought those newspapers and oohed and ahed over the latest news had consumed her to the point where she could no longer live. People felt responsible. It certainly was a vicarious responsibility, but it certainly shouldn't have been taken and shouldn't, as literal in the way that someone firing a gun at someone deliberately to kill them is responsible. But guilt is massive, and it was in that case. Fast forward to today, and we might have another example of the way guilt works in the intersubjective. Remember, the intersubjective, which is where society and culture and so much more exist, can accommodate contradiction and is not conscious, so it doesn't reason, it doesn't have agency, despite having massive influence. It's a product of mutual agreement, disagreement, fantasy, prejudice, kindness, wisdom, lunacy, confusion, uncertainty, fear, all sorts of things. And it exists in us in the form of words, memories, and perceptions and beliefs and all the other bits and pieces of what we feel constitutes the way the world works when others cooperate and exist alongside you. The rules of existence intersubjective are not the same as the rules of existence of physical reality. Both are equally real, but they're very different. And the same applies to the subjective. And at the same time, the hierarchy of dependence has not changed and never will. Physical reality is at the top, and without it, nothing else can exist. The subjective is a product of physical reality, and the intersubjective is a product of subjectivity of as many people make up a society. That's a bit circular. It's not meant to be an argument, a proof. It's really more a description. And society is highly sophisticated. It is a shame, which I've moaned about in previous podcasts, that sociologists don't understand the sophistication of what they're studying. Consequently, their discipline is not a discipline really. It's a sort of chaotic flailing around trying to make the intersubjective subject to the principles of materialistic determinism and make it subject to analysis and logic, when it's vastly more than that. Yes, it can contain and does contain logic, but it also contains non-logic, and its rules of existence are non-logical. In the intersubjective, you can have incoherent, inconsistent, incomplete, and vague entities, whereas in physical reality that would of course be utterly impossible. So the rules of existence differ, but existence is equally real as far as we are concerned, not as far as maybe the birds in the sky are concerned, between the three domains. They're all interlocked. The physical is ultimate, and it is a supreme one, without which subjectivity could not exist, and certainly the intersubjective could not exist. So there is a hierarchy of dependence. But despite that hierarchy, with the intersubjective being the most dependent, the nature of the intersubjective is vastly more interesting, involved, and I wouldn't say complex, but nuanced and varied. I can't quite get the words. And so, looking at intersubjective, you then consider it, at least I do now, I'm doing now, in relation to guilt. Because guilt has a presence in the intersubjective. It has a presence in the subjective, but in reality, of course, physical reality, I should say, it's nowhere to be seen. Just the same way society doesn't exist in physical reality, nor does culture, nor does all sorts of things. Fear, love, hate, passion, thoughtfulness, sympathy, sympathique in the French word, it's a lovely word, and all these things. They are very special to the intersubjective and the way we think of them in subjectivity, because after all our thoughts are ours and no one else's. But in a strange way, language, which gives us the ability to talk about the intersubjective in a way that we could not before we had it, brings the intersubjective into our subjectivity. It's like an import process. But strictly speaking, the intersubjective itself, rather than talk about it, is not inside our heads. It's not anywhere. It's a nowhere reality. That's highly sophisticated and really quite beyond the ken of the primitive determinism that dominates what should be the discipline of sociology, but is really little more than a desperate example of people lacking the method and perspective to do any justice to what they claim to study. And sadly, a similar fate has beset philosophy, where it's in effect crucified itself. I mean, history will look back on the fate of these two absolutely essential disciplines and think, what on earth were they playing at? In the Enlightenment, particularly after the Catholic religion was kicked out of Britain, except of course for large parts of Ireland, and the monasteries were disestablished and removed. The kings have stolen all their land and status and so on. It was very common to talk about scholasticism and how backward we were because of the intellectual dead-end mentality of quasi-theocratic attitudes, or just theocratic attitudes. But the problem with Enlightenment was that all that stuff was swept away, and people thought the reign of logic and reason would be supreme. Yes, a great advance was made in many ways, but in the age of reason, they didn't understand what it was to reason, what was necessary. And it's necessary to use logic, but to understand logic, you had to save the law of non-contradiction from exterminating itself, from becoming a nonsense. Because you have to give respect for the word contradiction, to accord it meaning, when contradicting itself is intolerable to logic. A fully logical system has no contradiction in it. It cannot. Oh, if you want to be clever as a logician, you say, oh, well, we'll accept contradiction in the system and put it in brackets, what have you. That doesn't let them escape from the fact that the very word contradicting itself, is forbidden. So, to get around that, what we do, because we humans are pretty clever, is we just say, okay, if we're going to get on with the world and understand things, we've got to accept contradiction. On the wider scale in politics, this is the maturity of democracy, because that accepts disagreement and contradiction and treats it seriously, not with disrespect. It's rather like if you own a large and vicious guard dog, you don't set it loose to go around biting people and, threatening other animals and so on and so forth. No, of course you don't. You give it due respect and you use it appropriately. Contradiction is very, very important. It's the most important non-logical word in language, and possibly the most important word in all human understanding. It's that important, but instead people think they toss the word around without really understanding its significance, without being able to accept and give at least temporary meaning and status of truth to the word contradiction. It would be impossible to reason. It would be impossible to think coherently. It's that significant. So we have a situation with Arday that almost overnight his suicide, which no one would think was a good thing, maybe one or two genuinely malevolent people might, but no humane person could possibly think was a good thing. Whatever he did, he suddenly tried to turn him into a martyr. Now, there's no doubt his death was a tragedy. A tragedy involves, you have to have a fatal flaw, and it usually involves individuals, although some people think it could involve nations and so on and so forth, possibly. There's a principal fatal flaw in Shakespearean tragedies, you see this, but in general life you can. Someone might have a character flaw, and they might be indecisive when they need to be decisive, too prone to cogitate and think things up, whilst the world goes on, and then they lose the ability to prevent something really nasty happening to them or to others, because they've been too busy, as it were, excuse the unpleasant remark, their head up their arse. Some people accuse me of that. Well, fair dues, you have to judge me by what I say. If it is stupid or head up the arse, then, switch off. Or give me a bit more of a chance to try and explain, whichever way. And what happened was rather grotesque. Cambridge University and previous academic institutions to it used him. They wanted him to be wonderful, an example, an exemplar of all they thought was liberating for a particular group of humanity. Not for humanity itself, but for a group they wanted to patronise, for their own feeling of self-righteousness and goodness. And so, Arday was no fool. I think he was pretty smart in many ways. And he thought, well, look, he soon identified the buttons to press. And they danced to his tune, so he thought. To an extent, I think he, in a small way, maybe 30%, was the architect of his own fate. I wouldn't say his death, but certainly he worked seemingly in partnership with those who wanted him to be their poster boy. So a train of academics at John Moores University and other academic establishments thought this was wonderful. It also gave them a chance on the sideline to, as it were, stick it to them in relation to enemies in their imagination, the enemies of progress and decency and respect and liberalism, to make them angry. And that always, quite often, amuses ideologues, because they see people dancing up and down, getting frothing at the mouth, rather like a miserable little child being baited in a playground by often more mature and sometimes malevolent older children, or just children the same age who happen to be well ahead of them. So they think, oh, we call them names and see them jump up and down. That's extremely funny. Yeah, I have an axe to grind. It happened to me. But that's another story. Another story. I'm tempted, but I shan't. So, at Cambridge, they promoted this fellow, and he went along with it. Now, he wasn't to know. One critical thing when you're dealing with ideologues is that if you're useful to them, they will love you to bits. Once they find that you're no longer useful and you become a liability, they will with equal enthusiasm turn against you, even if you subscribe to principles which they hold dear and you totally conform to the ideology. Ideology is a way that people's thinking is hijacked by a mental algorithm. So in effect, your thoughts do your thinking for you. Now, it sounds like a paradox, but talking about you, it's your consciousness. In other words, when the algorithm clicks in to develop political, social, moral judgments on your behalf, intervention of consciousness or criticism of consciousness is removed. So consciousness is in effect, the conscious control of thought is in certain areas cut off, and an unconscious algorithm spits out thoughts, beliefs, attitudes automatically, robotically. And this particular feature can be multiplied by the number of people who are inculcated with the same ideology. So what ideology does is it actually destroys individual agency and creates a sort of mob in waiting for a button to be pushed. Ideologues can act very quickly, and this partly explains the overnight creation of Arday the martyr. a few buttons were pushed, and ideologues can turn into a mob at lightning speed. So when you're dealing with ideologues en masse, you have to act very, very swiftly to prevent that from happening. If you don't, then it is quite easy for a power block to be formed of people with pre-established conformity in their heads. They're not, strictly speaking, individuals in particular aspects, in this case moral, social and political. They're actually have a sort of clone ideology in their heads. Part of the nature of ideological inculcation is that it strips people of agency, and that agency is effectively transferred to an abstraction. That's what people think. It's called the state or whatever. In reality, what's really going on is a small group of people. In the UK, it could number less than 10,000. Get the thrill of power, and they control them with alacrity and with great efficiency. Is this a conspiracy theory? Well, you just have to look at how things are happening to think more and to consider this might be an intersubjective reality of immense significance. The agency is not in the intersubjective. It's in all those individuals who still have agency, but only in certain areas, the ability to act on the prompting of what they believe. But what they believe is created largely by the ideological algorithm which is controlling our thoughts. It isn't related to consciousness or conscience of those so inculcated. However, going back to those mountains of flowers, guilt is rather special because it can actually bypass ideological dictate. I have no doubt that the highly intelligent academics at Cambridge and elsewhere and educated felt guilt that they had to, in their minds, eventually when he was at Cambridge, kick him off the pedestal that they had built for him and enticed him to climb. This is a really ugly scene. Now, in the case of Diana, Blair soon realised that he was playing with fire. While he started off happily slugging off the monarchy, and I think he would have liked to have seen it gone, and he would become President Blair. I think he rather fancied that. But he soon realised that when the intersubjective lets rip, particularly guilt, reason flies out of the window, because guilt is an elemental emotion, a bit like fear and hatred. It is elemental. You could argue that it might be a metamorphic creation of a combination of fear and possibly hatred, I don't know, self-hatred. But it's a bit complicated. I think guilt's elemental. Emotions come, like in so many other areas, you get fundamentals which can combine and metamorphose into something else. I think it occurs in emotions. You talk about love, hate, for instance. It's rather a special sort of thing. I, in my own small ways, it's tiny. I was brought up in a huge house, for instance, which is a Georgian masterpiece. You could pay to go around it now. And despite me having many happy years as a child, my grandmother used to hold huge parties every summer, several weeks, with maybe 20 or 30 children and many more adults. We had separate dining rooms, large dining rooms, for the children, the adults. The adults were in the state dining room, and the children were in what we call the lower ward, which would seat 30 or 40. Tables groaning with food, all sorts of loveliness. This was in the 1960s, the last gasp when people had servants. Though at that time we were quickly told to change them and call them staff. I loved it. But a brief moment when we were leaving the basement, when we were clearing out the furniture after the trust was taking over, the stuff was not grand enough to be shown to the public. My mother turned to a National House curator who said to her, as the National Trust curator, "You must have loved it when the times were good." And my mother said, "No, I hated it." Now that was because she and my grandmother on my father's side didn't get on, and my grandmother controlled the house. My mother hated it. And that got under my skin. And even now I have a conflicting feeling about that place. The emotional side says to me, if it was burnt down tomorrow, I would not weep. A nice glassy mound, maybe with some children's things on it and picnic area. I would have loved it like that. But the rational side of me is very plain. That would be a most awful tragedy architecturally, and also because hundreds of thousands of people visit the building and genuinely enjoy it because it is a masterpiece. And the way it relates to the garden and so on and so forth, the organic relationship to the countryside, the building and vice versa, is superbly planned. And the National Trust have actually restored a lot of that because in our time we didn't even hardly knew that existed. We were in a way, because of our ignorance, Philistines. And you shouldn't live in palaces because it gives you ideas. Anyway, the vigil for Arday and all this sort of stuff, I believe is really, was prompted, not necessarily those attending, most of them not, was prompted by academic guilt. In the same way, the Mountains of Flowers was prompted by the guilt of the general public, certainly quite a section of it, a feeling that they had, metaphorically of course, consumed Diana to the point of her death. Now remember, I'm not talking logically here, I'm talking emotionally. There's always a bit of logic there, because to describe anything you have to obey certain laws of logic. I'm not arguing that. But the intersubjective society, culture and soul is vastly more sophisticated because a metamorphosis can occur in very strange ways. In the intersubjective, two wrongs can join together to make a right. How come? Well, you can be right for the wrong reasons. That sort of is relevant, even though I'm abusing the word right. In one case, right is correct. In the other case, right is morally proper. But you see, strangely, ideology tends to conflate the two, whereas normal people don't. Normal people see a difference between right and being right. Rights and being right. It's a very important distinction, and where it's two are conflated, you then start getting very serious problems. That's a bit sort of arcane perspective, which maybe I should stop now and get back to the fundamentals. What motivates political movements is not just logic or justified anger or what have you. It's much, much more involved. Now, I'd never studied sociology, but I know enough from what I've seen. It's rather like, unfortunately, I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. From what I've seen, we're dealing with something very, very, very interesting. And it distresses me that commentators have virtually no idea of the engine of society and how its significance, vital significance for cooperation, and equal importance that politics has to engage with society to make as much sense out of that chaotic chaos in our heads, to generate and create good law and changing law as the circumstances change. Though the demands of humanity are constant, the means of satisfying them constantly changes. So that throws utopianism out of the window. And ideology is essentially utopian. Ideologues are very confused people and very vulnerable to things like guilt because they can't handle it. It's like a sort of hidden hand forcing them to do things which there's nothing in the ideology handbook tells them about that. Ideology is very, what do you call them? Primitive in many ways. Sorry, I don't mean to insult primitive people, but it's very. It can't handle love. It can't handle emotions. The idea that a metamorphosis of emotion is completely beyond ideologues. Reason is beyond them in many cases. Disagree with an ideologue, and particularly an academic, they'll usually find the excuse, oh well, what you've written is rubbish, or what you said is rubbish. And then if you question them, they say, your arguments are incoherent. They don't attempt, and they don't want to attempt, dissecting an argument and pointing out particular weaknesses or where things could be improved and so on and so forth. It's just switch on or off. You either agree or you disagree. If you disagree, then you are not really properly human. And consequently, throwing insults at you or treating you as if you really didn't deserve to exist is quite acceptable. It's indeed a moral duty. And this develops from fear. They are frightened. And the reason why they're frightened, and many of the people who've elevated, the academics who've elevated Arday to the status of martyr, despite all the evidence that he was a flawed, tragic individual, many of them are genuinely frightened because they don't control a large part of their thinking. That's controlled by the algorithm. But it still remains true that I think, hence I am. In other words, our ability to be conscious, our consciousness, depends upon the process of thinking. It's an effect of that. It's not the thinking itself. Confusing cause with effect is a classic error. It's similar to in dimension to conflating influence with power. Society has no power, but it has incredible influence. When you influence someone, you feed them information or misinformation. They then go and act. It's they who have the power, or, if it's misinformation, it's they who suffer the consequences of the impotence or the unintended use of their authority in an ignorant way. So you may have been indirectly empowered them or gave them the motivation to display, unintentionally of course, the extent of our ignorance and impotence. These distinctions are important, and if you don't bother to make them, then you don't really understand what's going on. The people who say authority is power, information is power, knowledge is power. Well, does it mean that they're all the same? No. Significant differences. So, Arday, a genuinely tragic figure. The academics, powered by guilt, in effect, stripping him of their protection, having made him so vulnerable. I wouldn't say they're tragic, but they're pathetic. and very dangerous. The University of Cambridge, if an institution could be tragic, is suffering from a fatal flaw that it had lost the ability to understand and appreciate why it exists, and instead, from force of fashion and intersubjective development of ideology, it lapped that up. It is in a very dangerous position. I suspect that the ideology is so strong in the academic ranks that short of a major purge, and that means dismissal of those who do not come round to understanding that they need to get rid of what's making them mentally robotic. I think Cambridge could, in the end, reduce itself to the status of a moderate polytechnic in fancy buildings. What an appalling tragedy! But worse, the social implications are gigantic. Society can only stand so much. English society and the society of the constituent nations of the UK, and they do have different societies, but there's a sort of shared interest sufficient to say there's a form of society shared by all of them, is pretty robust, strangely. So there's still a lot of hope. But the fact I had to put it in those terms is, I think, pretty frightening. The management of guilt, in a way, is something that politicians don't really understand. And it's not really something that they're likely to understand in the near future. Blair, as I say, I think when he realised what he was doing, panicked. And he stopped his slagging off of the monarchy, and his hope of becoming President Blair was put well onto the back burner. He meddled with things he didn't really understand. In the same way, Cambridge, when they were promoting Arday to a level where he could sustain, were playing with fire. And when guilt comes out, it can cause the most appalling things. So I think the first thing is that Cambridge management need to accept that we're not dealing with a situation that's entirely logical. You can't just press buttons and get things to change overnight. I think the important thing is they have to address the emotional dimension, and they have to take society and the intersubjective and its reality, the things that exist in them, very seriously. And what has happened is the consequence of philosophical ignorance, dating back to the early 20s, when Russell accepted, or even earlier, when Russell accepted Wittgenstein as a student in Cambridge and then promoted him. Initially, Wittgenstein joined Cambridge without a degree, not qualified at all. It was only later, in the late 30s, that his Tractatus was awarded him a degree. All that, for a lot of that time, on and off, he was teaching. Now, there was a period when he went as a former Perda in on the continent where he taught little children. And he wasn't entirely a kind man in that activity at all. This god of philosophy wasn't quite like that. In his Tractatus, he was fixated on logical propositions and so on and so forth. What a proposition was, we never really discovered. And at the end of his Tractatus, he concluded with possibly the most censorious and arrogant words ever uttered by a philosopher. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. My God! And then I think he sort of changed his mind a bit. And after he died, some people put his paperwork together to produce a thing called investigations. And he changed his mind hugely, he thought. And instead, he preached the idea, in effect, that the meaning of words comes from usage. Well, and in the process, a form of relativism developed, quite ignoring, as Wittgenstein ignored, that there is a shared physiology of perception and brain structure, which gives an absolute foundation to all human languages. But he just ignored that. It is fantastic. Now, having said that there's a lot to be said in the way a language operates, which does depend on the intersubjective and usage. There's no doubt about that. But the fundamentals do not. Some, of course, believe that everything is in our heads when we're born. They say, educare, educare, a little chant, you know. It's rather odd. If you dissected a human being to find out why this life, universe and everything exists in a child's head, it has to be drawn out by some kind of, you encourage their creativity. That's bullshit. It's a strange regression to Leibniz, where he believed the same thing. We were monads, and the whole of creation was in us, each individual potential. We reflected ourselves, had the universe in our side, so we're seeing, as it were, inside ourselves. And he had a strange belief in an assembly of monads, with, of course, God being the big boss. And he'd sort of assumed that extension, that we think we can have depth and receive things around us, was just an illusion. It was actually already built into us. And this is strange because it harks back to ancient Greece and Parmenides, who felt the same thing. Parmenides had a huge impact on philosophy, holding it back possibly 200 years. Genius, in a way. And Zeno, his student, was the author of The Paradox of the Arrow, which Russell thought was extremely significant, and he's right, because it's evidence of non-logic. Russell never really got his mind around that, for all his brilliance. So, back to Arday. He is a tragic figure, there's no doubt about that. But, because he was partly brought down by a fatal flaw. If there is another tragic part in this, it's Cambridge University. The academics, I don't think so much. I think guilt is the engine that drives them. And I think for many of them, I believe it may even be conscious guilt. That's what, when you combine that with ideological utilitarianism, where the ideology's objectives are, prime objectives are its survival and spread, and should humans get in the way, in extreme, they should be crushed. Think about Stalin, he was very like that. As were Pol Pot, Mao, and go the other side, the so-called right wing. AH was like that. There's nothing particular about ideology on the left that makes it any more humane or evil than that on the right. They're all the same. They're power obsessed. Humanity comes secondary to power. Or I should be more correct, to undisputed and ultimate authority. Because most dictatorships have a seed of their own destruction within, which is rooted in the unintended consequences of their ignorance of the exercise of authority. That distinction is almost unknown to people because they're fixated about knowledge is power. Oh, God, give me a break. People find that really hard to get their little minds round. I wouldn't say little minds. They're often very highly intelligent people. It's just that they can't escape in many cases, or find it very difficult, cultural blocks. Just like the left ring, right ring metaphor. They can't understand that there's something outside that authoritarian spectrum, that being democracy, which is an open system as opposed to closed systems that seem to be the only choice. Open system exists to find out what to do. Closed systems, be they socialism, communism, I don't know what, any ism you like, centrism, they all, in effect, in the long run, they all aim at a utopia. And they are either overtly authoritarian or covertly authoritarian and more patient. For instance, centrists are much stronger believers in manipulation, propaganda, and a very more gradual approach. So they don't mind if it takes 50 years, 100 years. Whereas Dryden far left, ditto far right, they want it tomorrow, or at least, within a few years. And if that means people have to suffer to get to this heaven on earth, so be it. There's a brutal utilitarianism about that, to the extent that they will happily suffer their own to get there. There's a religion that has a similar sort of precept. Many religions tend to behave that way, but one has an overt precept. Arday was a victim of a combination of guilt and ideology. That's really what got him. Yeah, he didn't see that coming. A lot of people wouldn't, actually. And he certainly played people's delusions and wished to be virtuous to what he thought was his advantage. They put him on a pedestal, used him, and then smashed that pedestal. They may have had no choice but to do that. But the fact that they set him up in the first place makes that act grisly and inhuman, and it betrays the real nature of ideology, that its prime objectives, survival and spread, justify in the minds of our ideologues. Even if they're dealing with someone who's been fully paid up member of the ideological group, believing in all its principles to the bottom of his or her heart, if they're no longer useful and become a liability to ideological objectives, they are to be crushed and treated the same as any enemy that they think threatens ideological spread and survival. We're looking at a very brutal and inhuman form of utilitarianism. Meanwhile, normal people look on aghast and are rather impotent because they don't really understand what's going on. Thanks for listening. Long one today. I won't put much in the précis in the transcript below. It isn't a transcript, but a few words, because it's a bit involved. But I hope to put a few points. And I hope you find this useful. Guilt's the big one here. Bye for now.